Thursday, 11th of January, 2024. A Sydney lawyer's office. David John Heine, great-grandson of the founder, signs the members' voluntary liquidation papers. Sean Wengel and Michael Brereton of William Buck, the joint liquidators, countersign. 137 years, 5 generations. The Heine family name leaves the Australian Corporate Register intact, solvent, with no buyer. 138 years earlier, 1886. A Devon-born millwright's apprentice named John Heine, 29 years old, opens a workshop in Redfern. Butcher's hooks, carcass rails, meat mincing machines. John Heine has no patent, no capital, no rich father. In 1886, a Devon apprentice built Australia's first power press. In 1940, his presses armed the Pacific War. In 2024, his great-grandson signed the liquidation document. This is not the story of how John Heine died. This is the story of how Australia stopped needing him. Chapter 1. The Devon Apprentice. Buckfastleigh, Devonshire, England. 14th of February, 1857. A market town on the southeastern edge of Dartmoor. Wool mills, slate quarries, sheep country, a single railway line running down to Totnes and the sea. John Heine is born into a family of working tradesmen. 1873. Aged 16, John Heine is apprenticed to Wilcox and Son Millwrights and Founders, Buckfastleigh. 4 years of trade. The English millwright tradition, the men who built and serviced the steam engines, the watermills, the foundries, was at its height. A millwright's apprentice in Devon in the 1870s was learning a craft that traced back 400 years. 1877. Trade completed. Age 20. Here's the thing. A young Devon millwright in 1877 had 2 options: stay in England and join an established firm, working under masters who would never retire and accept small wage rises across 40 years, or emigrate. The colonies needed engineers. John Heine took the second option. About 1881, he sailed. Records conflict on the exact year. Some sources say 1879. On the ship Northumberland, others say about 1882. But by the early 1880s, he was in the southern hemisphere. He did not arrive in Sydney and open a workshop. He spent 2 years in New Zealand as a labourer, building dry stone walls in country districts. He drifted back across the Tasman. About 1884, he was in Sydney, working as a tradesman and foreman at Howe and Rowe, a firm that made sheet metal machines. He tried his hand at gold prospecting. He worked as a blacksmith to prospectors at goldfield camps. None of it stuck. By 1886, John Heine was 29 years old. He had no capital, no patent, no factory, no commissions. What he had was 4 years of Devon millwright training, 8 years of practical sheet metal experience, and the conviction that Sydney's growing food industry, its butchers, its abattoirs, its small jam makers and biscuit factories, needed equipment that nobody in the colonies was making. He opened a workshop, sole trader, J. Heine, carcass rails, meat mincing machines, sausage fillers, brine pumps, the base inventory of any Sydney butcher's shop in the late 1880s. The address has been the subject of academic dispute. The Encyclopedia of Australian Science and Innovation records the founding date as 1886. Period newspaper advertisements via the National Library of Australia's Trove Archive place John Heine, engineer, 17 Gibbon Street, Redfern, advertising by 1888. The company's own history uses 1886. What is not disputed is the trajectory. A Devon-trained tradesman with no capital in 1886 walked into Sydney with an idea. 137 years later, his great-grandson would sign the papers that closed the firm. Chapter 2. The Empire Builder, 1890. John Heine, 33 years old, The Redfern workshop has expanded. The first significant government contract erupted upon gas fittings for the New South Wales Government Railways. A single contract that paid for new equipment, new staff and the rent on the workshop for the year. 1891, Sydney, the Royal Agricultural Society Show, the annual showcase of Australian manufacturing. John Heine enters his sheet metal working machinery. He wins first prize. 1892, the same show, the same prize-giving committee. This time, John Heine enters his can-making machinery. First prize again. 2 RAS show prizes in 2 consecutive years. The colonial engineering press takes notice. Let that number sit for a moment. A Devon-trained apprentice with no capital had, within 6 years of founding, won 2 consecutive Royal Agricultural Society prizes in 2 different categories of sheet metal manufacturing. The Sydney engineering establishment had to take Heine seriously. 1892 also brought a New South Wales Public Works contract for launch engines. The state government, its railways, its harbour boards, its public works departments became a regular Heine customer. The colonial state was the largest single source of manufacturing demand in late 19th century Sydney, and John Heine was now on the list. Around 1890. The first automatic can-making machinery, the Australian domestic food canning industry, jam, condensed milk, meat, fruit, had been buying imported British and American equipment. Now it had a Sydney supplier. 1895. John Heine builds his first inclinable press to his own design. The press is the foundational sheet metal machine. The inclinable press allows formed parts to fall away from the die under gravity. Every can, every cup, every cone, every drawn shape pressed in Australia for decades would trace through a press of the type Heine first built in 1895, about 1900. The automatic body forming and side soldering machine for food cans. The Sydney Jam Company becomes a major customer. Australian food canning shifts from imported equipment to Heine equipment. The Redfern workshop expands. By 1899, the operation is trading as the Dial Engineering Works at 88 to 90s George Street, Redfern. A second-generation workshop with multiple production benches, apprentices on the floor, and a growing customer list across the eastern states. 1907. The Model 4G can-making machine launches. The machine that will dominate Australian can-making for the next 2 decades. From the IXL jam factories to the Edgell tomato canneries, from the Rosella sauce works to the condensed milk plants of every state capital, Australian food canning was equipped, in its majority, by Heine. 1907 also brought the partnership change. John Heine. Senior's eldest son, John Heine Jr., is made partner. The company name changes. John Heine and Son. John Heine Sr. is 50 years old. The and son on the masthead means he is no longer alone. He has built an empire from a workshop in Redfern. The empire now has a successor. Chapter 3. The Cyclops Years. 1910. The 4th of April. John Heine and Son joins the predecessor of what would become the Australian Industry Group. The membership begins on a specific date and runs continuously. By the time the company closes in 2024, it will have held membership for 114 years. 1913. A small factory in Hay Street, Leichhardt, 3 suburbs west of the Redfern Works, in the Inner Western Industrial District. 4 staff. The Powerhouse Museum curator's records describe the operation. John Heine began manufacturing flat-frame tricycles for children with a staff of 4. The tricycles are made of sheet metal, Heine's specialty. Pressed steel frames, wire-spoke wheels. A line of children's vehicles that would, over the next 60 years, become one of the most recognisable Australian-made brands of the 20th century. 1915. The brand name is registered, Cyclops, read that again, The Cyclops brand, the sheet metal tricycles, scooters, pedal cars, dolls prams and children's vehicles that filled Australian backyards for 60 years, began as a John Heine and Son product line in a Leichhardt factory of 4 staff, 1917. A young Sydney painter and sculptor named Arthur Murch begins his apprenticeship at John Heine and Son. He will stay until 1924, 7 years on the Leichhardt floor. The man whose Australian landscapes would later hang at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, who would later sculpt Australian war memorials, started his working life pressing children's tricycles for Cyclops. Meanwhile, in Redfern, the Model 4G can-making machine continues its dominance. For 20 years, every major Australian food canning operation, IXL in Hobart, Rosella in Melbourne, Edgell in Bathurst, the meat canning operations of every state capital, runs on Heine equipment. 1928, the 18th of August. John Heine Sr. dies in Sydney. 71 years old, he had begun an apprenticeship in Buckfastleigh 55 years earlier. He had emigrated 47 years earlier. He had founded the firm 42 years earlier. He had partnered with his son 21 years earlier. He died as one of the largest sheet metal manufacturers in Australia. The Sydney Morning Herald runs the obituary. The colonial Devon apprentice had become a Sydney industrialist. Control passes to the sons. John Heine Jr. takes the masthead. The young son, 18 years old as a corporate designation, becomes the family corporate identity. The second generation begins. The dossier marks the period after John Sr.'s death as a documented gap on individual successor, names beyond John Jr. Multiple Heine sons joined the firm in the 1920s. The exact division of roles between them, who ran which workshop, who handled which customer base, is not documented in any surviving source. What is documented is that the firm survived the transition. The Leichhardt operation expanded. The Redfern operation continued. The Cyclops brand grew. The Model 4G continued to ship. Australia entered the Depression with one of its largest sheet metal manufacturers under family ownership, fully solvent, fully staffed. Chapter 4. The Depression Years, 1929, October, New York. The Wall Street Crash. Within months, the contagion reaches Australia. 1930. The Australian economy contracts. Wool prices collapse. The country's largest export loses more than half its value over the next 3 years. Wheat prices follow. The Commonwealth Bank tightens credit. Manufacturing orders fall. The Australian government, under Scullin, accepts the Niemeyer reform program, wage cuts, government spending cuts, austerity. 1933. Unemployment peaks above 30% in Sydney, the worst employment crisis in the country's history. Thousands of skilled tradesmen, fitters, turners, sheet metal workers, machinists, out of work. The Depression hollows out Australian manufacturing. Here's the thing. John Heine and Son survives the Depression for 3 reasons. The first is can making. In an economic collapse, the food industry contracts less than any other sector. People still need to eat. Australian jam makers, milk canners, and biscuit firms keep ordering Heine equipment because canned food is the cheapest consumer category in a depression. The second is government contracts. The New South Wales Railways, the harbour boards, the public works departments all continue to need replacement parts and maintenance equipment. Heine's 1890s customer base holds. The third is Cyclops. Australian parents during the Depression buy their children second-hand Cyclops tricycles where they cannot afford new ones, but every backyard still feeds back into the Leichhardt production line. The second generation, John Heine Jr. and his brothers, hold the company through the worst decade of the 20th century. Australia loses dozens of foundries and machine tool makers, between 1929 and 1939. The Adelaide Engineering District contracts. The Melbourne foundries shrink. Some of the great 19th century engineering firms, the names that had grown up alongside John Heine Sr., disappear. John Heine and Son does not. The Redfern workshop continues. The Leichhardt factory continues. The Cyclops line continues. The can-making machinery line continues. By the late 1930s, war preparations begin. The British Empire is rearming against Germany. The Australian government, under Lyons, then Menzies, is identifying which firms have the engineering capability to mass-produce military equipment if needed. The country had failed to maintain a wartime industrial base after 1918, and the country's defence planners were resolved not to repeat the failure. The exercise is conducted quietly. Department of Defence officials visit major Australian engineering firms. They inspect machinery. They photograph workshops. They interview foremen. They compile lists. In Adelaide, in August 1939, a month before war is declared in Europe, a decision is made to build a second small arms ammunition factory at Hendon, in the western suburbs of Adelaide. Capacity target 100 million rounds of .303 rifle ammunition per year. The factory will need machinery, lots of it. Presses, dies, gauges, cutters, formers. The decision-makers in Canberra need to know which Australian firms can supply the equipment to build a 100 million rounds per year factory from scratch. They have two firms in mind. Chapter 5. The machines that made the bullets. August 1939, Canberra. The Department of Defence finalises the decision. A second small arms ammunition factory to join the original Lithgow small arms factory in the New South Wales Central West will be built at Hendon, Adelaide, capable of making 100 million rounds a year. A month later, on the 3rd of September, Britain declares war on Germany. Australia follows the same day. The British Empire is at war. 11th of June, 1940. The Australian government creates the Department of Munitions, 8 directorates, each handling a different aspect of munitions production. One of them is the Directorate of Machine Tools and Gauges. The director, Frederick G. Thorpe, a mechanical and electrical engineer, a company director, a man with deep contacts across the Sydney and Melbourne engineering communities. Thorpe's directorate has a single, specific task: equip the new ammunition factories, the machinery, the dies, the precision gauges. Without the right tooling, no quantity of brass, gunpowder or labour can produce ammunition to military calibre. Two firms get the main call: John Heine and Son, Sydney, and W. G. Goetz and Sons. A number of smaller firms support them. The Sydney workshop, 53 years after the founding, becomes a wartime sovereign supplier. Here's the kicker: John Heine did not make bullets. John Heine made the machines that made the bullets. The presses, the dies, the cartridge case formers, the precision gauges. Every brass case that came out of Hendon, every .303 cartridge that armed the Australian Imperial Force, the Royal Australian Navy, the Royal Australian Air Force, passed through tooling that traced back, through the Department of Munitions, to a Sydney workshop founded by a Devon apprentice in 1886. November 1940. Small Arms Ammunition Factory No. 3 is operational. Head stamp MH. Small Arms Ammunition Factory No. 4 follows. Head stamp MJ. Both factories are running by the end of the year. February 1941. The Finsbury Cartridge Case Factory in South Australia opens. More Heine machinery. More presses, more dies, more gauges. 1943. Salisbury opens as a tracer round annex. The South Australian Ammunition Manufacturing Complex, Hendon, Finsbury, Salisbury, runs through machinery substantially supplied by John Heine and Son and W. G. Goetz and Sons. The dossier records a documented gap on quantities, the number of presses Heine supplied, the tonnages, the contract values. These survive only in the National Archives of Australia's Department of Munitions files. The numbers have never been published. What is documented is the responsibility. The Directorate of Machine Tools and Gauges placed the burden of equipping the small arms ammunition factories on two private Australian engineering firms, and Heine was one of them. Hendon's output armed the Pacific. From Tobruk to Kokoda to Borneo, Australian rifles fired Heine-tooled brass. The .303 was the standard rifle round of the Australian Imperial Force for the entire Second World War. Every Australian rifleman in the Pacific Theatre fired ammunition from a factory equipped by the Sydney workshop in Redfern. The country that armed itself in 1940 did so on the back of a 53-year-old Sydney engineering firm founded by a Devon apprentice. 84 years short of the 137 years the firm would eventually run. Hit subscribe before we get to the part where the same political class that armed itself with John Heine machinery in 1942 cut the tariffs that kept John Heine in business. The part where four governments, Whitlam Labor, Hawke Keating Labor and Howard Liberal, across nearly 30 years systematically dismantled the protected manufacturing economy that paid for the bullets that fought the Pacific. Subscribe before you scroll. Chapter 6. The Post-War Pillar, 1945. Australia returns to peace with an industrial sovereignty it had never previously possessed. The wartime expansion of the metal trades, the apprenticeship pipelines, the workshop networks, the precision tooling capability built by the Department of Munitions, does not contract. The country has, for the first time in its history, the capacity to make almost anything it consumes. John Heine and Son comes out of the war as one of the largest sheet metal machinery makers in the country. The wartime contracts ended on VJ Day in 1945, but the relationships, the equipment, the trained workforce remain. 12th of December 1947, a Sydney meeting room. John Heine, David's great-uncle John, a senior member of the third Heine generation, is presiding over a meeting of the Metal Trades Employers Association. He collapses during the meeting. He dies the same day. The Sydney Morning Herald runs the obituary the following day, 13th of December 1947. Industrialist dies, Mr. John Heine. December 1948, a year later, a Heine Memorial Foundation for the Australian metal industry is announced. The man had presided over the MTEAEA at one of the most consequential moments in Australian manufacturing history. He died on the job. Let that number sit for a moment. In the 61st year of the firm's continuous engineering production, 2 years after the war that had made the firm indispensable to Australian sovereignty, a Heine man died at his MTEA podium. The post-war boom. Australian factories work 3 shifts: white goods, refrigerators, washing machines, electric stoves, hot water systems, fill suburban homes. Every panel pressed in an Australian factory, every can sealed in an Australian cannery, every steel cabinet bent in an Australian workshop traces through pressing equipment. Heine supplies it. The 200 series C-frame mechanical power presses become the post-war flagship product line. The full tonnage range, from a 2-ton benchtop machine to a 350-ton floor unit, the 200A, the 207AG, the full series. Sheet metal working machinery, guillotines, folders, swagging and beading machines, the full can making line, 2-piece and 3-piece body makers, end presses, seamers, food canning, automotive panel pressing, Holden in Melbourne, Ford in Geelong, the British Motor Corporation in Sydney, white goods, railway engineering, defence. Every Australian heavy industry category buys Heine, 1967. The family moves the operation to 273 Edgar Street, Condell Park, in Sydney's Canterbury Bankstown district. 16,200 square metres. A modern industrial plant. The Leichhardt and Redfern works close. 81 years from the Redfern founding. 56 years before the lawyer's office on the 11th of January, 2024. The clock that would eventually count to 137 years was running. The family is at its zenith. The third generation, David's father's generation, is running an operation that supplies every major Australian manufacturing customer, hundreds of staff, multi-shift production. The 200 series presses ship to every state in Australia and to export customers across Southeast Asia. In Canberra, a man named Gough Whitlam, the Labor member for Werriwa, is rising through the parliamentary ranks. He has views on tariff policy. Chapter 7. The First Cut. 7 o'clock in the evening. Wednesday, 18th of July, 1973. The Whitlam Labor government, 8 months into its first term, announces a 25% across-the-board tariff cut. Effective from midnight. Read that again. 7 p.m. Wednesday evening, 18th of July, 1973. Across the board, 25%, effective from midnight, 87 years into the firm's history, 26 years after the great-uncle's MTEA collapse. The Whitlam government cut the protective wall that had kept Heine and every other Australian engineering manufacturer commercially viable against cheaper imports. Before the cut, the numbers were specific. The economist Alex Milmau records them. Tariffs for clothing reached 55%. For motor vehicles, 45%. For machine tools, comparable. After midnight on the 18th of July 1973, every protected Australian manufacturer woke up 1/4 less protected against imported equivalents. The reasoning was inflation. The 1973 oil shock had hit. Australian wages were rising. The Whitlam government's economists argued that tariff cuts would discipline domestic prices. The reasoning was wrong. Milmau, looking back, over the next 7 years, manufacturing employment fell by 80,000. 1st of January 1974. The Industries Assistance Commission replaces the Tariff Board. Heine, and every other Australian protected manufacturer, now appears before a body explicitly mandated to recommend further reductions in protection. For John Heine and Son, the math was specific. Every 200 series C-frame press they built competed against Japanese, Taiwanese and West German equivalents priced for the same Australian market. The 25% tariff had covered the gap between Australian wages and imported manufacturing costs. From midnight on the 18th of July, it did not. The order book began to thin. The press tooling business, the dies and forming equipment that Australian sheet metal shops bought from Heine to maintain their lines, held longer because tooling specifications were factory-specific and customer relationships were long. But the new machine sales began to fall. The Whitlam tariff cut did not kill Heine in 1973. It changed the trajectory. Long-range capital planning at Condell Park shortened. Apprentice intake thinned. New machine orders contracted. The order book pivoted from growth to defence of existing customers. The Industries Assistance Commission, between 1974 and 1983, made successive recommendations to reduce the effective tariff rate further. The Fraser Liberal government, in office from 1975 to 1983, accepted most of those recommendations. The Whitlam dismissal of November 1975 did not reverse the tariff cuts. The Fraser government did not restore the protected manufacturing regime. The first cut was the marker. Australian manufacturing, Heine included, was from that night onward on the path the Industries Assistance Commission was recommending. The Whitlam cut alone did not close the company, but every Heine board meeting from 1974 onward was held in its shadow. Chapter 8. The Second Cut. May 1988. The Hawke-Keating government delivers the economic statement, the largest tariff reduction since Whitlam, 25th of May, 1988. Senator John Button, the Industry, Technology and Commerce Minister, delivers his industry plan ministerial statement to the Senate. The motor vehicle tariff drops from 57.5% toward 45% from the 1st of July, then 2.5% annual decrements toward 15%. The same logic applies to machine tools. The same logic applies to sheet metal machinery. The same logic applies to every category of equipment Heine had ever made. 12th of March, 1991. The House of Representatives. Paul Keating, as Treasurer, delivers Building a Competitive Australia. The ministerial statement completes the program announced in May 1988 and drives the average effective tariff rate toward 5% by the year 2000. And this is where it gets genuinely insane. The same political class that armed itself with Heine machinery in 1942, the same Department of Defence successor agencies that had handed Heine the responsibility of equipping the country's small arms ammunition factories, now systematically dismantled the tariff protection that had kept the firm commercially viable for half a century. Whitlam Labor cut tariffs in 1973. Hawke-Keating Labor cut them again in 1988. Keating finalised the program in March 1991. The Howard Liberal government from 1996 to 2007 completed the implementation through to the year 2001. 4 governments, 2 parties, 18 years of bipartisan tariff demolition. The protected Australian engineering economy that had been built across the Federation era, that had armed itself in 2 world wars, that had pressed every Holden body panel and Edgell tomato tin and Hills Hoist clothes line bracket, was systematically wound down by political consensus. The apprenticeship pipeline followed. The National Centre for Vocational Education Research records that Australian apprenticeships peaked at 161,000 in 1990. By 1994, 4 years later, the number had fallen to 131,000. 30,000 fewer apprentices in 4 years. A separate ABS series gives a slightly different figure, 175,500 in 1989, but the trajectory is identical. The Australian trade apprenticeship system, which had trained the sheet metal workers and tool and die makers and machinists who bought Heine equipment for a century, collapsed within 5 years of the Keating tariff statement. John Dawkins's 1988 higher education reforms, the unified national system that converted colleges of advanced education into universities, were not the sole cause of the apprenticeship collapse. But they accelerated the cultural shift away from trade training. A generation of Australian school leavers who would have gone into apprenticeships in 1970 were now expected to go to university by 1990. 104 years into the firm's history, John Heine and Son was operating in a market that no longer existed. Chapter 9. The Succession. 2001. The Howard government's tariff program completes. The average effective protection rate sits below 5%. The protected Australian manufacturing economy, built between Federation and the 1970s, is functionally over. Through the early 2000s, John Heine and Son survives. The Condell Park plant operates. The 200 series presses still ship. The customer base, what remains of Australian food canning, white goods, defence sheet metal, keeps the lights on. 2010. By the centenary of the firm's continuous Australian Industry Group membership, John Heine and Son has been a member for 100 years. 5 generations of Heine men have signed the membership renewal. 2016. A company profile records 60 staff and an annual turnover around 14 million Australian dollars. 60 people. A century earlier, the firm had employed many hundreds across the Redfern and Leichhardt works. 60. The succession problem was generational, not financial. The Condell Park plant was solvent. The press tooling business was profitable. The aftermarket parts and servicing operation paid for itself. What the company did not have was a sixth Heine generation prepared to inherit it. David John Heine, the great-grandson of the founder, the fourth generation, was the chairman. His son Timothy, who went by Tim, was in the business. His grandson Tristan was the sixth generation, the one who would have to decide. Tristan's cousins had moved into other professions. The nephews had built other careers. The math of the family had thinned. In David's verified words, in previous generations, just about every male member of the family joined the company, and then it started to thin out by the time it got to my generation. Now Tim is the only one in the family from his generation working in the business. The market had thinned to match. The Australian food canning industry, Heine's first major customer base from 1890, had consolidated into a handful of multinational operations, buying European equipment. White goods manufacturing had largely moved offshore. Automotive panel pressing, Holden in Adelaide, Ford in Geelong, Toyota in Altona, would all close their Australian plants between 2016 and 2017. The three largest Australian car makers, the customers who had bought Heine's sheet metal presses for 50 years, closed their Australian operations within 2 years of each other. The closure dates were already known when the Heine family started thinking about succession. By 2022, the conclusion was inevitable, 135 years into the firm's history, 2 years short of 137. A 60-employee pressmaker in Condell Park, supplying a domestic Australian manufacturing market that had been shrinking for 50 years, with no sixth generation prepared to inherit, was not a business to pass on. David John Heine made the decision. The firm would close. Not because anyone had failed, not because of bankruptcy or fraud or theft, because the time had come. January 2023. CBRE launches an expression of interest campaign for 273 Edgar Street, Condell Park. The agents, George Holden, Jason Edge and Keegan Ridings, set a closing date, the 2nd of March 2023. The end was scheduled. Chapter 10. The 11th of January, March 2023. The CBRE Expression of Interest campaign closes. The 273 Edgar Street site, 16,200 square metres of Canterbury Bankstown industrial land, is under negotiation. August 2023. Grey Online begins the dispersal auctions. The 200 series presses, the can-making machinery, the precision tooling, the gauges, the dies. All of it goes to other Australian engineering firms, to mining equipment operators, to scrap metal merchants. The Australian sheet metal community spends 3 months watching the Heine inventory liquidate in real time on a website. Thursday, 11th of January, 2024. A Sydney lawyer's office, a general meeting of members of John Heine and Son Proprietary Limited is convened. The resolution is straightforward. The company will be wound up. Sean Wengel and Michael Brereton of William Buck, the joint liquidators, are appointed. ACN 00005907. Company number issued nearly a century ago. Members' voluntary liquidation. The Technical Corporations Act term for a solvent. Wind-up directed by the shareholders themselves. Not bankruptcy, not administration, not external receivership, not a forced sale to a foreign acquirer. The Heine family signed the document. 137 years. Read that again. 137 years. From the workshop on Gibbon Street, Redfern, to the lawyer's office where David John Heine signed the resolution. The verified explanation on the public record 9 months earlier in the Australian Industry Group feature published on the 4th of April 2023. An associate, who also leads a family-owned foundry, made the observation that quite often the family outgrows the company. That's really what's happened with this company. In previous generations, just about every male member of the family joined the company, and then it started to thin out by the time it got to my generation. Now Tim is the only one in the family from his generation working in the business. So it's time. And it took me a while to consider the pros and cons of selling, but I'm quite happy now. We are one of the last few family-owned foundries in Australia, but I've made my peace with everything, and having fully retired, there's no time to go to work anymore. The man who signed the document was the great-grandson of the Devon apprentice. His son Tim was in the business. His grandson Tristan was the 6th generation. The 6th generation would not inherit. By the end of January 2024, the plant at 273 Edgar Street was empty. The Condell Park presses, the can-making lines, the precision tooling, gone. The Heine machinery that had armed Hendon in 1940 was dispersed across the Australian second-hand market, scrap merchants and mining operations. And this is where it gets genuinely insane. The country that armed itself with Heine machinery in 1940 did not, in 2024, ask any successor firm to make the next generation of presses. The capability was gone. The market was gone. The family was done. 137 years. Chapter 11. What John Heine leaves. 2024. The plant at 273 Edgar Street, Condell Park, sits zoned IN1 General Industrial. 16,200 square metres of Canterbury Bankstown land. The CBRE marketing continues. Warehouse 2, 4,676 square metres, is offered with overhead and jib cranes to 20 tonnes, 1,200 amps of power, gas, a 100 kilowatt solar system, and a weighbridge. The press tooling is dispersed. The 200 series machines are scattered across Australian engineering workshops. Surviving Heine presses appear regularly on Machines for You and Gray's auctions. The Practical Machinist online forum carries the verified testimony of an Australian sheet metal apprentice. I was always in awe of the mighty John Heine machinery that I operated as an apprentice. The John Heine brand survives only residually. The website remains. The aftermarket parts and servicing references persist. No new Heine machine has been built in Australia since the dispersal of August 2023. And in Adelaide, F.W. Hercus, the lathe maker founded in May 1920, the firm that built 9-inch and 10.25-inch lathes for the same Department of Munitions Directorate that bought Heine presses in 1939, the firm that made 23,000 lathes across its working life, 15,000 of the 9-inch model, 8,000 of the 10.25-inch, had already followed the same path. Bought by the Durden Group in 1987, machine tool production ceased by 2005. Same arc, same villains, same epitaph. Lesson 1. Australia armed itself with John Heine and then stopped needing John Heine. In 1940, the Australian government handed Heine and W.G. Goetz the responsibility of equipping the Hendon ammunition factory. By 1973, the same government cut the tariffs that kept Heine alive. By 1991, the next government completed the program. The country that asked Heine to arm the Pacific in 1940 did not, by 2024, ask any successor to make the next generation of presses. Lesson 2. A family business is a generational bet on the market. The Heine family bet on Australian sheet metal and can making for 137 years. Through 2 world wars, through the Depression, through the tariff cuts of 1973, 1988 and 1991. The bet ran out not because they failed, but because the market they served stopped being there. Lesson 3. A solvent wind-up is a different kind of death. John Heine and son was not killed. There is no Beaufort engine in this story, no foreign acquirer, no asset-stripping executive, no collapsed pension fund. The Heine family closed a solvent business because Australia had stopped giving them anything to do. That is a quieter ending than the Channel usually documents. In the long economic history of the country, it is also the most common. The empty plant on Edgar Street has a for lease sign. A school group walks past it on a Tuesday morning. None of them know the building used to make the machines that made the bullets. The country that armed itself with Heine in 1940 had nothing left for Heine to make in 2024.